A German test pilot bailed out over enemy territory in 1945. Certain Americans would torture him to death. Instead, they did something that would change his life forever and prove why America won more than just a war. This is the story of Hans Verer Lurch and the moment one sergeant's decision rippled through the next 60 years. March 1945. Hans Verer Lurch's Messrs. Schmidt was trailing black smoke over the Ree Valley. American fighters circled above him like wolves stalking wounded prey. He was 26 years old, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced test pilots, and he was about to die in enemy territory. His hands shook on the control stick, not from fear of the crash, but from what would come after. If he survived the bailout, he would face American soldiers. And Hans knew exactly what that meant. For years, Goebbels' propaganda machine had filled every German mind with nightmares about American captivity. He had heard the stories in pilot briefings and mess. Americans tortured prisoners for information. They murdered German pilots on sight, especially test pilots who knew too many secrets. Some stories claimed they handed Luftwaffe prisoners over to the Russians, which was a death sentence. Other whispers spoke of prison camps where men starved, where guards beat you senseless for speaking German. Hans was not naive enough to believe all the propaganda, but had seen what happened to shot down American pilots in Germany. Some Wehrmacht units still followed the rules, but others did not. And the SS, they had killed Allied airmen just for surviving their crashes. He had heard about it firsthand from overmatched officers who were disgusted by such violations of military honor. Why would the Americans be any different? Why would they show mercy to an enemy pilot who had spent 4 years helping refine the weapons that killed their brothers? The altimeter spun down 2,000 feet, 500, through a shattered canopy. He could smell burning oil and hydraulic fluid mixing with the cold March air. The fighter that hit him was long gone, probably already radioing his position to ground forces. They would be waiting for him. 1,000 feet time to jump or die. Trying. Hans grabbed the canopy release with his left hand, his right fumbling with the harness. The metal was slicked with his own blood. He had taken shrapnel in his shoulder when the first burst of .050 caliber rounds tore through his cockpit. The wound throbbed with each heartbeat, warm blood soaking through his flight suit. He thought of his wife, Hildegard, and their daughter back in Bad Wurschen. Would they even be told what happened to him? Or would he just disappear into some American camp? Another name on a list that never came home? 500 feet, the Bavarian countryside rushed up at him. Fields and forests he had flown over 1,000 times, now enemy territory. He pulled the release. The canopy tore away. Ice-cold wind blasted his face, stealing his breath. He hauled himself up against the G-forces and threw his body into the void. The parachute snapped open, jerking him hard enough to make him gasp in pain from his shoulder. Below, his Messrs augured into a farmer's field in a shower of earth and twisted metal. Smoke billowed black against the blue spring sky. For years of test flying, hundreds of hours evaluating every fighter the Reich produced. And it ended here, drifting down into enemy hands with nothing but his flight suit and the knowledge in his head. Knowledge the Americans would torture out of him. He could see them now. Soldiers running across the field toward his landing spot, rifles raised, jeeps bouncing along dirt roads, kicking up dust. They would be on him in seconds. This was how it ended. Everything his superiors had warned him about was about to come true. But Hans Verer Lurch was about to discover something that would shatter everything he had been told about the enemy. And 30 years later, he would still be trying to understand in times repay times what happened in the next 60 seconds. Hans hit the ground hard, his injured shoulder exploding in white-hot pain. He collapsed into the dirt, tasting blood and earth, gasping. His parachute dragged him several meters across the muddy field before he managed to slap the quick release with his good hand. The silk deflated like a surrender flag. He lay there for a moment, trying to breathe through the pain. Above him, the sky was impossibly blue, peaceful, indifferent to the war being fought beneath it. He could hear boots pounding closer, American voices shouting words he could not quite make out over the ringing in his ears. This was it, the moment every German pilot dreaded. Hans forced himself to his knees, then his feet swaying. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood dripping from his fingertips onto the spring grass. He raised his right hand slowly, palm open, a universal gesture of surrender he had practiced in his mind 100 times, but never thought he would actually use. The American soldiers emerged from the treant, 5 or 6 of them, United States Army infantry, rifles trained on his chest. They were younger than he expected. Farm boys mostly, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion. The lead soldier, Hans, could see the sergeant stripes on his uniform, was shouting something, probably ordering him not to move. Hans's legs trembled beneath him. He kept his hand raised, tried to convey with his eyes that he was not a threat, that he was wounded, that he just wanted to survive the next 60 seconds. His mouth was too dry to speak. Even if he could find words, his English was terrible. He knew technical aviation terms, but little else. The sergeant approached cautiously, rifle leveled at Hans's head. Hans could see the man's finger on the trigger, see the calculation in his eyes. Another soldier circled behind him. Hans felt hands patting him down, roughly checking for weapons. They found nothing, just his blood-soaked flight suit and the iron cross pinned to his chest, which one soldier ripped off and pocketed without ceremony. Luftwaffe, the sergeant said, looking at Hans's wings insignia, then louder to his men. We got ourselves a Krupp pilot. Hans understood that much. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but only managed, "Ben, I am." The words died in his throat. The world tilted at odd angles. The sergeant studied him for a long moment, taking in the blood, the power of his face, the way Hans swayed on his feet, like a tree about to fall. Hans saw something shift in the American's expression. Not sympathy exactly, but recognition. One soldier seeing another soldier in trouble. Then the sergeant did something Hans never expected. He lowered his rifle. "Get the medic," the sergeant called over his shoulder, his voice sharp with urgency. "This one is hurt bad." A younger soldier, barely 20, with red hair and freckles that made him look even younger, ran up with a canvas bag marked with a red cross. He dropped to one knee beside Hans, easing him down to sit in the grass with surprising gentleness. Hans wanted to protest, to explain he could stand, but his legs gave out and the world was starting to spin. "Easy there, buddy," the medic said, his voice surprisingly gentle for someone who should hate him. He was already cutting away Hans's flight jacket with scissors, exposing the shrapnel wound in his shoulder. "Damn, you got chewed up pretty good." Hans flinched as the medic probed the wound, but the American's touch was careful, almost tender, nothing like what he had expected. Where was the brutality? The interrogation, the rifle butt to his face, the revenge for all those American pilots shot down over Germany. Morphine? The medic asked the sergeant. "Give it to him. He's no good to intel. If he bleeds out." Hans felt the sting of a needle in his thigh. And within seconds, the pain began to recede into a warm, distant fog. The medic was wrapping his shoulder now, talking to him in that soft voice, even though Hans could not understand most of the words. But the tone was like talking to an injured friend, not an enemy. "You'll be okay, Fritz. We'll get you patched up." The sergeant lit a cigarette, an American Lucky Strike, and to Hans's complete shock, offered it to him. Hans took it with shaking hand, drawing the smoke deep into his lungs. It tasted like real tobacco instead of the airsoft garbage they had been smoking in Germany for 2 years. Actual tobacco. The sergeant even held his lighter for him, cupping his hand against the spring breeze like they were comrades sharing a break. "What's your name, Kraut?" The sergeant asked slowly as if talking to a child. Little Hans managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Hans Verer Lurch." "Well, Lurch, you picked a hell of a day to fall out of the sky. War's almost over anyway. You're lucky you ran into us instead of some of the boys who lost friends to your Luftwaffe. They might not have been so friendly." Hans understood maybe half of that, but he caught the essential message. He was lucky, incredibly, impossibly lucky. He had expected to be beaten or shot, and instead an American medic was bandaging his wounds, and a sergeant was sharing cigarettes like they were fellow soldiers instead of enemies. It didn't make sense. Nothing about this made sense. "Medic says we got to get him to the aid station." One of the soldiers called out. "Load him in the jeep," the sergeant replied, already moving on to other concerns, treating Hans's capture as routine business rather than a moment for revenge. As they carried him across the field on a stretcher, Hans looked back at the burning wreckage of his message. For years of war condensed into twisted metal and smoke. He had survived dozens of test flights in experimental aircraft, dodged British Spitfires and American Thunderbolts, pushed prototype jets to their limits, and now it was over. He was alive, wounded, but alive, in the hands of men who were supposed to be monsters. The jeep ride to the aid station was a blur of morphing and confusion. Hans drifted in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversation in English he could not follow, seeing flashes of devastated German countryside rolling past bombed-out buildings, burned tanks, the detritus of a lost war. At some point, someone gave him water, held the canteen to his lips like he was a child. Another impossible kindness. When he coughed and some spilled down his chin, the soldier just wiped it away and tilted the canteen more carefully. Easy does it, Captain. Small sips. This was not what gerbils had promised. This was not the American brutality he'd been warned about since 1941. This was something else entirely. And Hans was about to discover. It was only the beginning. Hans woke in a bed. Not a cot on a concrete floor. Not a pile of straw in some barn. An actual bed with clean white sheets that smelled of soap. His shoulder had been properly bandaged. The pain reduced to a dull, manageable ache. Sunlight streamed through a real glass window, and somewhere nearby, someone was playing American swing music on a phone raft. Glenn Miller, if he was not mistaken. He blinked, trying to orient himself. This was clearly a field hospital, but nothing like the nightmare scenarios he had imagined during the long years of war. The room was clean, organized, staffed by medical personnel who moved with calm efficiency rather than chaos. Other wounded soldiers occupied nearby beds. Some American, some German, lying side by side. Nobody was screaming. Nobody was being beaten. The Americans and Germans were receiving the same care. A nurse noticed he was awake. A woman in an American Army uniform with captain's bars on her collar. She approached with a clipboard and a professional smile that seemed genuine rather than forced. Guten Morgen, Captain Lurch, she said in heavily accented but functional German. I am Captain Morrison. How is the pain this morning? Hans struggled to sit up, his mind still foggy. You speak German? A little, enough to check on our patients. She examined his dressings with practiced hands, her touch professional, but gentle. You were lucky. The shrapnel missed the major vessels. You will have full use of your arm once it heals. 6 weeks, maybe 8. I do not understand, Hans said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Why are you treating me? I am your enemy. Captain Morrison gave him a puzzled look, as if the question itself was strange. Because you are wounded. That is what we do. She said it so matter-of-factly, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world, as if there was no other possible response to a wounded human being. Over the next 3 days, Hans's confusion only deepened. The Americans fed him the same rations they gave their own wounded. Not bread and water, but hot meals with actual meat, vegetables, coffee with real cream, even chocolate bars. When he mentioned he was still hungry after one meal, they brought him more food without hesitation, without using it as leverage or demanding information in exchange. The medical care was meticulous. A surgeon came by daily to check his wound, changing dressings, watching for infection with the kind of careful attention Hans had not seen in German hospitals in years. They gave him penicillin, that miracle drug the Germans had heard about but rarely had access to. Pain medication came regularly on schedule, not withheld as punishment or leverage. But the biggest shock was how the American staff treated him. Not as an enemy, not even as a prisoner exactly, but as a patient who deserved care. The nurses asked about his comfort. Would he like another blanket? Was the light too bright? Did he need help getting to the latrine? The orderlies helped him wash, helped him dress without shame or cruelty or mockery. One young private, a kid from Iowa named Miller, with an open, friendly face, even tried to teach him English phrases during his rounds, laughing good-naturedly at Hans's terrible pronunciation. No, Miller would say, grinning. It's thank you, not thank you. You got to make the th sound. See. He would stick his tongue between his teeth to demonstrate, looking ridiculous but patient. Hans tried it. failed miserably, and Miller just laughed and patted his good shoulder. We'll work on it. Captain, you've got time. War is almost over anyway. This casual friendship bewildered Hans most of all. Miller was 19, had probably lost friends to German fighters, had every reason to hate Luftwaffe pilots. Yet here he was, treating Hans like a comrade instead of a murderer. Where was the hatred, the desire for revenge, the anger at what Germany had done? On his fourth day in the hospital, a United States Army Air Force officer arrived, a major named Patterson, maybe 40, with graying hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. He pulled up a chair beside Hans's bed, moving slowly, deliberately like someone who had all the time in the world. He opened a folder filled with papers. Captain Lurch, he said in perfect, unaccented German, I understand you are a test pilot for the Luftwaffe. Quite an experienced one from what we have gathered. Hans's heart sank. Here it comes, he thought. The interrogation, the pressure, the threats, the moment when the massive kindness would fall away. Yes, sir, he said carefully. I was assigned to the Air Pro Bungelen, the test centers. Patterson nodded, studying the papers. The Reich's aircraft evaluation facilities. You've evaluated most of the Luftwaffe's fighters. I imagine. The Mi-262S, the jets. This was dangerous territory. Hans knew he had to be careful. I flew many aircraft types, sir. It was my assignment. I'm sure you did. Patterson leaned back, his tone conversational rather than accusatory, like they were two colleagues discussing work. Here's the thing, Captain. The war is almost over. Everyone with eyes can see it. Germany is finished. The question now isn't who wins. We know that answer. The question is what happens next? What happens to men like you? Hans said nothing, waiting for the trap he was certain was coming. We've captured a lot of your aircraft. Patterson continued, almost casual. Jets, rocket planes, experimental designs, fascinating machines. But we need someone who understands these aircraft to help us evaluate them properly. Someone with real experience, not just technical manuals and guesswork. Hans stared at him, not quite believing what he was hearing. You want anyone to help you? I want you to do what you've always done. Fly and evaluate aircraft. Except now you'd be doing for us instead of the Luftwaffe. Patterson smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. The alternative is sitting in AP camp until the war officially ends, then getting shipped home to whatever's left of Germany. Your choice. It was not really a choice, and Patterson knew it. But what stunned Hans was the offer itself. The Americans were not torturing him. They were proposing a job. They were acknowledging his expertise. Why would you trust me? Hans asked, genuinely confused. Who said anything about trust? Patterson's smile widened. You'll be watched. Armed guards, restricted areas. But we need your skills. And frankly, Captain, you've got nowhere else to go. Hans thought about Hildegard and his daughter. Thought about the ruins of Germany. Then thought about what he loved most, flying. The Americans were offering him a chance to keep doing what he was born to do. I will help you, he said quietly. Patterson stood and offered his hand. Hans shook it, feeling the surreal nature of the moment. A Luftwaffe test pilot shaking hands with an American major, not his enemies, but his colleagues. Welcome aboard, Captain Patterson said. Let's get that shoulder healed up. We've got a lot of aircraft for you to evaluate. The Americans moved Hans to a more secure facility near Frankfurt within a week. But secure turned out to mean something very different than he had imagined. Yes, there were guards and fences and checkpoints, but his quarters were comfortable. The food remained good, and the Americans treated him with consistent professional respect that never wavered. The base commander, Colonel Raymond, was a pragmatist who had flown P-47 Thunderbolts in combat over France. He invited Hans to dinner his first night at the new facility, serving pot roast and potatoes while asking detailed questions about Luftwaffe training methods. Not interrogation, genuine professional curiosity. Our boys are good pilots, Raymond said, cutting his meat with precise movements. But your Luftwaffe gave us hell for years. I lost 2 wingmen to Bf-109S over France in '44. Good men. What made your training program so effective in the early years? Hans hesitated, unsure if this was a trap, a trick to make him reveal secrets. But Raymond's face showed only professional interest. One aviator talking to another about the craft they both understood. We had time. Hans said carefully, still testing the waters. Early in the war, before everything fell apart, we could train pilots properly. Hundreds of hours of flight time by the end. He shrugged with his good shoulder. We were sending boys up with 50 hours. They died in days, sometimes hours. Raymond nodded grimly, his expression darkening. Same story everywhere. War grinds men up faster than you can train them. Doesn't matter which side you're on. He poured Hans a glass of wine. Actual wine, not the rot gut that had been available in Germany for years. Here's to the poor bastards who didn't make it. Ours and yours. They drank to the dead. Hans felt tears prick his eyes, unexpected emotion welling up from somewhere deep. This American colonel had lost friends to German guns, had every reason to hate him. Yet here he sat, sharing wine with the Luftwaffe pilot, acknowledging the common humanity of loss. Over the following weeks, Hans met the team he would be working with, American test pilots, engineers, intelligence officers. They were initially wary, which he understood and even respected. But as they worked together, examining captured German aircraft, discussing design philosophies and performance characteristics, something unexpected happened. They became colleagues. There was Captain Jake Larson, a P-51 Mustang pilot, who had shot down 4 German fighters over the Rhine. He and Hans spent hours comparing notes on the Bf-109 versus the Mustang, debating the merits of different armaments and engine configurations. Their conversation started stiffly, professionally distant, but soon became animated. Even heated two professionals dissecting the tools of their trade with the passion of men who understood what it meant to trust your life to a machine at 20,000 feet. Your 109 turns better than my Mustang at low altitude, Son admitted one afternoon as they examined a captured Gustav model in the hangar. But above 20,000 feet, we owned you. You couldn't touch us up there. The supercharger, Hans agreed, running his hand along the 109's wing. We never solved that problem properly. In your range, my God, you could fly to Berlin and back. We would run out of fuel after an hour of combat. Larson grinned. That's what happens when you've got Packard Merlin engines and drop tanks. Though I'll admit, first time I saw a Me-262 jet scream past me, I nearly messed myself. You bastards and your jets almost changed everything. The casual profanity, the easy camaraderie, it felt impossible. They should hate each other. Instead, they were swapping pilot stories like old academy classmates, finding common ground in the shared experience of combat flying. The real breakthrough came when Hans first flew a captured P-51 Mustang. The Americans had one painted in Luftwaffe colors for evaluation, and they asked Hans to put it through its paces. Standing beside the aircraft, this beautiful American fighter that had terrorized German airspace for 2 years, Hans felt a complex mix of emotions churning in his chest: respect for the machine's elegant design, bitterness at what it had done to his comrades, and underneath it all, the pilot's pure childlike desire to fly something new. "She's all yours, Captain," Major Patterson said, gesturing to the cockpit like a man offering a gift. "Take her up and tell us what you think. No nonsense, just your honest, professional assessment." Hans climbed into the cockpit. The seat fit him perfectly. Americans and Germans weren't so different in size. After all, the instruments were logically arranged, easier to read than the cramped German equivalents. He went through the pre-flight checklist with an American engineer, translating when necessary, patient as Hans asked questions. Then he fired up the Packard Merlin engine. The sound was incredible, a deep, powerful roar that vibrated to the airframe, thrumming in his chest. German engines had their own music, their own character, but this was something else entirely. This was American industrial might condensed into 12 cylinders of raw power. Hans taxied to the runway, received clearance from the tower, and opened the throttle. The Mustang leaped forward like a thoroughbred released from the gate. The acceleration was asterisk, asterisk, brutal, violent, asterisk, asterisk, pinning him back in his seat harder than any German fighter ever had. He was airborne in seconds, climbing at a rate that made him laugh out loud, despite himself, despite everything. Good God, this thing could climb For the next 40 minutes, Hans forgot the war, forgot his wounded shoulder, forgot being a prisoner. He just flew. He pushed the Mustang through every maneuver he knew. Loops, rolls, high-speed dives, tight turns that pulled G-forces until his vision tunneled. He tested the stall characteristics, the control response, the incredible visibility from the bubble canopy. Magnificent. So much better than the claustrophobic 109 cockpit. He even attempted some combat maneuvers, imagining how he would have fought against his former comrades in this machine. It was exhilarating and sobering. This was what they had been up against. This was why Germany lost the air war. When he landed, Patterson and Larson were waiting on the tarmac, eager for his assessment. "Well," Patterson asked, "what do you think?" Hans climbed out of the cockpit, his face flushed with the pure joy of flight, his heart still racing. "It is a beautiful machine," he said. "Honestly, superior to the Bf-109 in almost every measurable way. The visibility, the range, the engine power at high altitude. It is remarkable, truly remarkable engineering." "What about weaknesses?" Larson pressed, curious. "Every aircraft has them. The roll rate at very high speed could be better," Hans said thoughtfully. "And the ammunition load is lighter than I'd prefer for ground attack missions. But as a pure fighter, as an air superiority platform," he shook his head admiringly in the hands of a good pilot, "it is devastating. We knew this, of course. We felt it every day in the sky, but actually flying one." He paused, searching for words in his limited English. "Now I understand why we lost." It was a moment of brutal honesty. These Americans had given him the chance to fly their finest fighter, and he had responded with unvarnished truth instead of pride. In that moment, something fundamental shifted. He was not just a prisoner helping his captors. He was a test pilot doing what test pilots do, evaluating aircraft objectively, without national bias. Over dinner that night in the officers' mess, the walls came down even further. Larson produced a photo of his girlfriend back in Michigan, showing it around with obvious pride. "Sarah," he said softly, "we're getting married when I get home. If I get home on time. She's already threatening to start without me." The other pilots laughed. Another pilot, Lieutenant Morrison, pulled out pictures of his 2 kids. "Jenny's 7 now. Tommy's 5. Haven't seen them in 18 months. They probably won't even recognize me." Hans felt in his flight suit pocket. They had returned his personal effects after initial processing and pulled out his own creased photograph. Hildegard, holding their 3-year-old daughter, both smiling at the camera on some sunny day that felt like another lifetime. "My family," he said simply, his voice thick. The Americans passed it around the table, looking at the photo with the same tenderness they had shown their own. No sneers, no mockery, no jokes about the enemy. Just men recognizing that the enemy pilot also had people waiting for him. "Beautiful wife," Morrison said quietly. "Your daughter looks just like her." "She is 3, Hans said, struggling with the English words. She will not remember me if I am gone too long." "You'll get back to them," the son said firmly. "War is almost done. They're already processing prisoners for repatriation. You'll be home before you know it." Telling her stories about the crazy Americans you met, Hans wanted to believe that with every fiber of his being, but more than the promise of home, what struck him most was a compassion in these men's voices. They were not guards and prisoner, not victors and vanquished. They were fathers and husbands, pilots and professionals, understanding each other's fears and hopes across the divide of nationality. That night, lying in his bunk, Hans tried to process everything. Every day brought new proof that the propaganda had been lies. The Americans were not monsters. They were professionals who took their job seriously, but never forgot their humanity. They followed rules, even when it would have been easier not to. They showed respect to an enemy pilot who had helped kill their friends, not because they were weak, but because they believed in something larger than revenge. This was not mercy born of weakness. This was discipline, conviction, strength. Hans began to question everything he had been told, not just about the war, but about what it meant to have honor. Maybe Germany hadn't lost just to American machines. Maybe they had lost to American values. Values that said a wounded enemy deserved care, that a prisoner deserved food, that a test pilot deserved the chance to keep flying. The Americans were showing him something more powerful than any weapon, the possibility that there was a better way to be human, and Hans Verer Lurch shot down over the Rhine, and expecting death was beginning to believe it. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Hans heard the news in the officers' mess at the base near Frankfurt, surrounded by American pilots who cheered, embraced, and wept with relief. They had survived. The war in Europe was over. Hans sat quietly at his table, processing what this meant. Germany had been completely defeated. His nation lay in ruins. Everything he had fought for had been for nothing, or worse than nothing. Given what was now coming to light about the camps, the atrocities, the systematic murder that had been happening while he flew his test missions. But his work with the Americans continued. If anything, it accelerated. With the war officially over, restrictions eased. Hans evaluated dozens of captured German aircraft over the following months. Not just fighters, but experimental designs, rocket planes, and jets that had never entered production. His reports were detailed, honest, and invaluable to American engineers trying to understand how German aviation had advanced even in the chaos of defeat. More than technical data, Hans provided context. He explained the design philosophies, the resource constraints, the desperate gambles taken as Germany's situation deteriorated. He told them which projects had been genuinely promising and which were propaganda fantasies, last-ditch hopes with no basis in reality. Then in August, just 3 months after surrender, Major Patterson came to him with a proposal that seemed impossible. "Captain Lurch," Patterson said, sitting across from him in a private office, "we've been impressed with your work. Very impressed. The Navy's test pilot program has authorized me to offer you a position." Hans looked at him blankly. "A position? As a civilian contractor, not as a prisoner, as an employee. You'd be released from POW status immediately, granted special immigration status, and allowed to bring your family to the United States." Patterson slid papers across the desk. "It's not charity. We need your expertise as we develop our own jet program. You'd be working alongside our test pilots, evaluating both German and American aircraft, contributing to research that will shape aviation for the next decade." Hans stared at the papers, unable to process what was being offered. "You want me to come to America? To stay? We want you to keep doing what you do best. Fly and evaluate aircraft. The only difference is you'll be doing it in America, with American citizenship as a possibility down the line, with your family safe and provided for." Patterson leaned back. "I won't lie to you. There will be Germans who see this as betrayal. But Germany is going to be occupied and divided for years. Your aviation industry is being dismantled. There won't be any test flying jobs for German pilots for a very long time. This is your chance to keep flying, to support your family, to build a future." Hans thought about it for 3 days. He wrote to Hildegard, explaining the offer as best he could in censored letters. Her response came 2 weeks later. The letter was practical, unflinchingly honest. "We have nothing left here, Hans. The house is destroyed. I am living with my parents in one room. There is barely any food. Your daughter asks about you every day, but soon she will not remember your face. If the Americans will take us, we should go. Germany needs time to heal, but we need to survive." In December 1946, Hans Verer Lurch signed the papers. He became one of the first former Luftwaffe officers to work officially for the United States military. He was not unique. Operation Paperclip would bring hundreds of German scientists and engineers to America. But Hans represented something different. He was not a rocket scientist building weapons of the future. He was a pilot, an evaluator, a man whose expertise was welcomed, but whose humanity mattered just as much. The Americans flew Hildegard and his daughter to the United States in early 1947. Hans met them at the airport in Washington, D.C., the first time he had seen them in nearly 2 years. 2 years of letters and photographs and hoping, but no touch, no certainty. His daughter was 5 now. She hung back shyly, holding her mother's hand, studying the stranger in American clothes who claimed to be her father. She had been 3 when he left. He had missed her 4th birthday, her first day of school, 2 years of her life that he could never get back. But Hildegard threw her arms around him and wept. She buried her face in his shoulder and shook with sobs that came from somewhere deep in the fear and uncertainty and impossible hope of the past 2 years. Hans held her, his own tears flowing freely, not caring who saw. "I didn't know if I would ever see you again," she whispered in German against his chest. "Every day I didn't know I am here," he said, his voice breaking. "We are here. We made it." Eventually, his daughter came to him slowly at first, testing, but then she smiled, a shy, tentative smile, and called him Papa. Hans picked her up, feeling how much he had grown, how much he had missed, and made a silent promise that he would never leave them again. They settled near Puxent River Naval Air Station in Maryland. The Navy provided housing, a small house in a neighborhood where other military families lived. It wasn't much, but compared to bombed-out Germany, it was paradise. Running water, electricity, stores with food, neighbors who were curious but not hostile. Hans flew experimental aircraft for the Navy, contributing to the development of jet fighters that would serve in Korea and beyond. His colleagues were former enemies, American pilots who had fought the Luftwaffe, but they became friends, real friends. They had their children over for dinner. They celebrated holidays together. They formed the kind of bonds only survivors understand. Hans never forgot what the Americans had done for him. In interviews decades later, he would speak with visible emotion about those first days after capture, the medical care given without hesitation, the decency shown when brutality would have been easier, the respect given to a man who had helped kill their comrades. "I could have ended up in Soviet hands," he would say, his German accent still faint after decades in America. "Russian soldiers were just 30 kilometers away when I was shot down. If my aircraft had gone down a little further east, I would have been captured by them instead." He would pause, the weight of that alternate history heavy in his silence. "I heard stories from Luftwaffe pilots who ended up in Soviet camps, starvation, forced labor in Siberia. Many did not come back. Those who did," he would shake his head, "they were broken men. Instead, I fell into American custody, and they saved my life. Not just physically. They gave me a future when I had no right to expect one. They gave my family a future. That sergeant who lowered his rifle and called for a medic instead of shooting me. I never learned his name, but he changed everything with that one decision." Hans maintained lifelong contact with many of the Americans he worked with during those crucial months. Major Patterson became a lifelong friend, visiting Hans and his family regularly. Even after both men retired, they would sit on Hans's porch in Maryland, drinking beer and talking about the old days, about aircraft they had flown, about the strange twist of fate that had turned them from enemies into brothers. Captain Jake Larson, the Mustang pilot who had once been wary of working with former Luftwaffe ace, stood as godfather to Hans's second child, born in America in 1949. At the christening, Larson gave a short speech Hans would never forget. "We were enemies for 4 years, Larson said, holding the baby with the awkward care of a man and used to infants. We fought each other in the skies over Europe. We tried to kill each other. That's just the truth of it. But we've been friends for 4 years now, and I hope we'll be friends for 40 more. I think that says something important about doing things the right way, even in war, especially in war." The room was quiet after that. Americans and Germans, both processing the weight of those words. Then Hans's daughter, now 7 years old and thoroughly American, broke the silence by asking loudly when they could eat cake, and everyone laughed. The moment passed, but Hans never forgot it. He thought often of Larson's words, doing things the right way, even in war, especially in war. Hans Verer Lurch worked as a test pilot until 1963, when he retired at age 54. By then, he had flown over 150 different aircraft types for 3 air forces, the Luftwaffe, the United States Navy, and later as a civilian contractor for NASA. He had contributed to the development of jet fighters, carrier operations, and early supersonic flight research. The boy from Württemberg, who had started flying gliders in the 1930s, had become a bridge between eras and nations, between enemies and allies, between war and peace. His daughter grew up thoroughly American, attended American schools, and married an American Navy pilot, continuing the family tradition. His grandchildren would be purely American with only stories and old photographs connecting them to Germany and the war that had shaped their grandfather's life. Yet Hans made sure they knew those stories. He made sure they understood why they mattered. Your grandfather was treated well because Americans believe in certain principles he would tell them. Even in war, even with enemies who had done terrible things, there are rules. There is dignity. This is what makes America different. Not that Americans are perfect, but that they try to live up to their ideals even when it is difficult. In 1985, a military historian interviewed Hans for an oral history project about test pilots. Near the end, she asked what he had learned from fighting for Germany and then working for America. Hans was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. At 76, his face was lined with age, his hair white, but his eyes were still sharp, still carrying the intensity of a man who had spent his life pushing machines and himself to their limits. I learned that the values a nation claims to hold are tested not in how it treats its friends, but in how it treats its enemies. He said, finally, Germany claimed to be superior, claimed to represent civilization and culture. But we treated our enemies, and even many of our own people, with brutality. America claimed to believe in human dignity and rule of law, and they actually lived up to those claims even when it was inconvenient. He paused, then continued softly. I also learned that showing mercy is not the same as being weak. The Americans who captured me were not soft. They had just won the most destructive war in history. They were strong enough to win, but also disciplined enough to follow their own rules about how prisoners should be treated. That is real strength. That is the kind of strength that builds something lasting. The interviewer pressed, "Do you think American treatment of prisoners affected the outcome of the war?" Hans didn't hesitate. Absolutely. When German soldiers knew they would be treated fairly if they surrendered to Americans, they surrendered more readily in the final months. When German pilots knew they would receive medical care instead of execution, they were less likely to fight to the death. American humanity was a weapon, not in a cynical way, but in a very practical way. It saved American lives by encouraging Germans to give up. He leaned forward, emphasizing his next point. And after the war, it won the peace. Germany became America's ally because Germans remembered how we were treated. We remembered the medical care, the food, the respect. We remembered that America offered us a future instead of revenge. That memory shaped post-war Germany more than any treaty could have. Hans Verer Lurch died on February 13th, 2003 at age 84, surrounded by family in his Maryland home. His obituary appeared in aviation magazines around the world, noting his contributions to test aviation and his unique position as a bridge between former enemies. At his funeral, several elderly American pilots attended, men who had fought against the Luftwaffe, then worked alongside Hans and later became his lifelong friends. They stood with Hans's American children and grandchildren, 3 generations who existed because one American sergeant had lowered his rifle and chosen compassion over revenge. One of them, Jake Larson, now in his 80s himself, spoke at the service. Hans used to say he got shot down over the Rhine and landed in America. Larson said his voice still strong despite his age. He meant it literally that day in March 1945, when his Messers went down and he parachuted into that field. But he also meant it figuratively. We gave him a chance to become American, not just in citizenship, but in spirit, and he took it. He became one of us. Larson paused, looking at the flag-draped casket. That's what made us win the peace, not just the war. We didn't destroy our enemies. We transformed them into allies. Hans was living proof that it works. That doing the right thing, even when it's hard, even when revenge will feel better, pays dividends for generations. In March 1945, Hans Verer Lurch expected to die, bailing out over enemy territory, wounded and terrified. He had been taught that Americans were brutal, that capture meant torture and death. Instead, he found humanity in the most unexpected place. A sergeant who lowered his rifle and called for help, a medic who bandaged his wounds with gentle hands, officers who recognized his expertise and offered him purpose instead of punishment, pilots who became colleagues, then friends, then family. Hans lived 58 more years after that moment. He raised a family in the country that had been his enemy. He helped America maintain its air superiority for generations. He became living proof that enemies can become friends. When principles guide actions, when mercy is seen as strength, not weakness, he never forgot the moment that Sergeant lowered his rifle. That split-second decision rippled through 6 decades, changing one man's life, changing his children's lives, changing the world in small but meaningful ways. This was not just one sergeant's kindness. This was American military doctrine honoring the Geneva Convention, even when enemies did not. It was a conscious choice to win the peace by transforming rather than destroying. Hans Verer Lurch expected death over the Reeve Valley in 1945. He found humanity instead. And in that humanity, he found a future for himself, for his family, and for the alliance between former enemies that kept peace in Europe for generations. Do you have a family story of World War II? Of prisoners of war, of enemies who became friends, of small acts of kindness that changed everything? Share in the comments below. These human stories remind us why principles matter even in the darkest times. Next day, we'll share another untold story from World War II. Subscribe so you don't miss. See you in the next video.